Welcome to the debate. So imagine you are sitting in this really sterile room across a desk from someone you've just met. Or, I don't know, maybe you're at a loud, crowded networking event holding a plastic cup.
The classic nightmare scenario.
Right. And someone looks at you, they smile, and they ask the single most terrifying question in the English language. So tell me about yourself.
I mean, your heart just pounds. The palms get sweaty.
Exactly. Your mind goes completely, utterly blank. And now imagine having to answer that existential question in a language you literally just started learning.
Yeah, it is pure unfiltered panic. The brain it just stops working at that point.
It really does. Because when you're acquiring a new skill, especially a language, you usually expect, structural precision. You want it to feel like engineering. You conjugate a verb, the syntax aligns, and the instructor hands you a good grade.
Right, it's very mathematical in the classroom.
But then you step into the real world and someone asks you to summarize your entire identity on the spot. That grammar chart goes straight out the window. We're looking at a communicative landscape that is, frankly, murky, unpredictable, and highly emotional.
It is the absolute definition of linguistic muddy waters. And, the way we teach people to navigate those waters actually says a lot about what we value in human connection.
Which brings us to our analysis for today's show. We are wading into those exact waters to examine the pedagogical strategies used to teach non-native speakers how to survive that dreaded prompt.
The tell me about yourself trap.
Exactly. And we're looking at a specific instructional framework from the Mr. English channel, featuring two educators, Leyla and Mark. And just to be clear on where we stand today, I'll be arguing that their quirky mini-story storytelling approach is actually a brilliant, essential toolkit. It's designed to break through language paralysis.
And I will be arguing that it's a completely reductive system that trains learners to build superficial caricatures instead of, genuine connections.
That perfectly captures the tension here.
Yeah, and I want to say I approach this material with a lot of sympathy for the learner. The goal of alleviating that blank mind anxiety is completely valid, but we really have to look critically at what we are sacrificing to achieve that comfort.
Well, let's talk about that blank mind, because it's not just a metaphor, right? It's a physiological response. When a language learner is hit with, "Tell me about yourself," it triggers a literal fight or flight reaction.
Cortisol spikes.
Exactly. The language center of the brain essentially gets hijacked by the amygdala. The result is what the source material literally jokes about, the learner freezing up and defaulting to these robotic, sterile statements. Like Mark jokes about just standing there saying, "I am human. I like things."
Which is a tragic place to be when you are desperately trying to make a good first impression in a new culture.
Right. So to solve this, Leyla and Mark build an accessible scaffolding using highly specific, memorable contrasts. They introduce themselves through what they call mini-stories.
Right. The whole Miami versus the mountains thing?
Yeah. We get Mark, who paints this vivid picture of himself as a 27-year-old fitness coach living in a vibrant, sunny Miami apartment. He loves the color red, he's obsessed with tacos, and he has a crazy but loyal dog named Rocky.
And then Layla is the complete opposite.
Exactly. On the flip side, we have Leyla. She's a 26-year-old photographer living in a cozy wooden mountain cabin. She loves yellow, prefers homemade pizza, and has a deeply judgmental cat named Lily.
A very judgmental cat.
Right. And this framework is incredibly pragmatic. It replaces the overwhelming pressure of defining your soul with a structured, highly memorable narrative that any learner can instantly emulate to stop the panic.
Well, look, it definitely stops the panic. I'll give you that. But I really have to question the cure here. If the problem is that learners sound like robots saying, "I am human, I like things," we have to ask if this solution actually cures the robotic nature of the introduction.
I mean, I think it obviously does.
See, I would argue it just introduces a different kind of automation. It creates what I call the quirk bot.
The quirk bot? Okay, I have to hear this.
Think about it. Does replacing "I like things" with a randomized modular list of eccentricities, for example, "I own a cat named Lily and I refuse to eat eggs," does that actually solve the problem of human connection? Or does it merely program a quirk bot?
I think that's a bit harsh.
But the material explicitly encourages learners to construct a persona out of arbitrary consumer preferences and universal complaints. Leyla talks about her visceral hatred of waiting in line, waiting for a bus. Mark talks about his absolute hatred of cold coffee and his refusal to eat seafood.
Right, to show personality.
But they claim this reveals, quote, the real us. It doesn't reveal character. Disliking cold coffee isn't a personality trait, it's just a biological preference for thermodynamics in a beverage. It doesn't add substantive depth to who Mark is as a human being.
Wait, but isn't that triviality the whole point? You are demanding a level of philosophical pacing that is incredibly daunting for someone who is just trying to navigate a conversation without stumbling over their vocabulary.
I'm not demanding philosophy, I'm demanding humanity. True conversational confidence requires articulating core competencies and values. By emphasizing these trivial dislikes, the framework risks teaching learners to construct a superficial caricature. It basically teaches them to occupy a very shallow communicative space.
I completely disagree, because you have to look at the psychology of how humans actually learn to speak under pressure. Let's talk about what linguists call the affective filter.
Okay, sure.
Think of the affective filter as the emotional bouncer in your brain. When you are stressed, anxious, or feeling judged, that bouncer crosses his arms and blocks access to your vocabulary and grammar. You physically cannot speak well.
The bouncer shuts down the club.
Exactly. The material is specifically engineered to relax that bouncer. By utilizing accessible, low-stakes topics, the affective filter drops. Take their discussion of siblings, for example. Mark mentions having two tall, protective older brothers that were like bodyguards. Leyla contrasts that by saying she was an only child with a very small family, just her and her mom, relying on books and imaginations. Discussing these dynamics allows learners to practice fluency without the immense cognitive bottleneck of translating high-level professional jargon.
Right.
It's a Trojan horse. You use the simple, low-threat vehicle of talking about dogs versus cats to smuggle in the complex, terrifying act of human interaction.
The Trojan horse analogy is clever, but we have to look at what happens when the soldiers actually come out of the horse, right? If you're listening to this right now, think about how you introduce yourself to someone important. You don't build trust by simply reciting your favorite primary colors.
No, but
Getting the vocal cords moving is a phonetic exercise, but the prompt is tell me about yourself, not demonstrate that you can vocalize words. When Leyla says that disliking waiting in line reveals the real us, she is conflating a universal human irritation with unique identity. Nobody likes waiting for a file to download. That's not a personality. That's just being alive in the 21st century.
But that triviality actually serves a physical purpose in the conversation. It's not just about what they're saying, it's about forcing the other person to speak. And this brings us to one of the most brilliant mechanical concepts in the source material, the conversational ball.
Right. The idea of throwing the ball to the listener.
Yes. The material demonstrates that these details are not meant to be a static monologue. They are tactical invitations. By embedding a specific, slightly idiosyncratic detail, such as Mark stating he is a fitness coach who is absolutely obsessed with action and comedy movies at the cinema, the speaker actively invites a follow-up question.
So the listener catches the ball.
Exactly. The listener catches the ball and naturally says, "Oh, really? What's the last good film you saw?" This shifts the burden of the conversation off the language learner and onto the native speaker. The learner doesn't have to sustain a sweaty 5-minute monologue. They just have to throw the ball and let the other person do some work.
Mechanically, the ball-throwing analogy is sound. I'll agree with that. But as an expert, I have to question the weight of the ball being thrown.
The weight?
Yeah. The analogy holds up functionally, but it fails substantively. In fact, if we look closely at the text, there are perfect examples of missed opportunities, moments where a heavy, deeply meaningful ball was briefly held and then immediately dropped in favor of a lighter one.
A heavy ball? Where do you see Leyla or Mark dropping a heavy ball?
Look at how Leyla describes her profession and her environment. She mentions that she is a photographer who takes pictures of nature and people to, quote, capture moments. And then a few breaths later, she mentions that she lives in a cold, quiet mountain cabin because it's, quote, the best place to think.
Right. Those are fantastic mini-stories. They paint a great picture.
But look at what they actually represent.
Capturing moments and seeking out isolation as a place to think are profound worldview-revealing statements. They offer a glimpse into her relationship with time, with memory, with introspection. That is a heavy, beautiful conversational ball. If someone throws me that ball, we are going to have a fascinating conversation about why they value quiet over noise or permanence over the fleeting moment.
Okay, sure, but
But what happens in the material?
they move on to the next topic.
They sprint past it. The methodology rushes right past these profound identifiers to get to rapid-fire, gamified debates over whether yellow is better than red or if homemade pizza beats tacos. The methodology undermines its own potential. It actively trains the learner to run away from true identity to get to the safety of easy trivia.
Wait. Hold on. Are you actually expecting someone who might barely have a grasp on the present perfect tense to casually drop a philosophical monologue about the passage of time?
I'm not saying a monologue, I'm just saying
That sprint away from the profound is a survival mechanism. The transition from the heavy capturing moments to the light loving the color yellow like sunshine is a calculated modulation of cognitive load. If you keep the conversation too heavy, the language learner is going to get crushed by it.
they won't get crushed if they
They don't have the vocabulary yet to discuss the philosophical implications of isolation in a mountain cabin. They do have the vocabulary to say, I like quiet places. You have to throw a light ball first, or the learner is going to drop it entirely.
Look, I understand the need for scaffolding, but we are confusing the initiation of a conversation with the ceiling of a person's capability.
I don't think it's the ceiling at all, and the source material actually proves it. They explicitly address how this framework is dynamic, not rigid. It possesses contextual adaptability, which is a highly sophisticated skill.
You're talking about their advice on filtering for different environments.
Exactly. Leyla specifically points out that if you are at a job interview, you wouldn't use the mini story about hating waiting in line. You would filter your traits. You would say, hi, I'm Leyla. I'm a photographer who loves capturing nature and I'm very patient.
Right.
Conversely, at a casual party, Mark would lead with his movie obsession to spark a fun chat. The framework teaches contextual intelligence. It empowers the learner to turn the dial up on professional skills when talking to a boss or turn it down for casual social engagement. It's not a cork bot. It's a dynamic equalizer.
I want to believe that. I really, really do. But if the framework was truly dedicated to contextual adaptability and sophisticated filtering, the final synthesis of the lesson wouldn't completely contradict that premise. We have to look at the ultimate challenge they present at the very end of the source material.
You mean the Tell Me About Yourself challenge they issued to their audience in the comments?
Precisely. After paying lip service to the idea of adapting your story for a job interview versus a party, what is the actual actionable instruction they give to the learners? They instruct the audience to use a rigidly simplistic three-part format: name, origin, and favorite thing.
Well, they use the examples of Carlos from Mexico, who loves to dance salsa, and Fatima from Egypt, whose favorite food is kashari.
Yes, and that proves my point entirely. When push comes to shove, the methodology regresses. It strips away the nuance of the mountain cabin, the protective older brothers, the patience required for photography. It boils the entire human experience down to, I am from this geographical location and I consume this specific item.
You're being incredibly uncharitable to the process of learning.
But look at the long-term effect. Let's talk about what happens in the brain. There is a concept called semantic muscle memory. When you are under stress, your brain doesn't look for the best word. It looks for the most practiced word. It's a panic reflex.
Okay, sure.
By drilling this reductive three-part list into the learners, we are training their semantic muscle memory to default to the trivial. When Carlos is eventually sitting in a high-stakes environment, perhaps an international networking event, and the adrenaline hits, he isn't going to suddenly manifest a profound mini-story about his core professional values. He is going to fall back on his training. He's going to blurt out that he likes salsa. That does not deliver the ultimate toolkit it promised. It delivers a formula for superficiality.
I completely disagree with your framing of that final challenge. You are viewing the Carlos and Fatima examples as the ceiling, as if that is the absolute best they will ever do. I view those examples as the floor. The instructional design here is brilliant, precisely because it scales.
How does reducing someone to their favorite food scale into a meaningful conversation?
Because it provides the architecture. The challenge in the comment section isn't meant to represent the totality of a person's existence. It is an onboarding ramp. When Fatima mentions koshari, she's practicing the fundamental architecture of the conversational ball in a zero-risk environment.
Okay, but
Once that architecture is mastered, once her affective filter is lowered, and she realizes she won't be punished for speaking, she can swap out the word koshari for the philosophical quiet of the mountains. The framework doesn't regress. It distills itself to its most accessible form to ensure participation. It's like training wheels on a bicycle. You don't mock the training wheels for not being a Harley-Davidson. You celebrate them for keeping the rider upright.
But if you leave the training heels on forever, you never actually learn how to balance. Yes, it avoids the blank mind, I concede that, but at what cost? Is it better to be a complex professional frozen in silence, or an approachable individual who enthusiastically declares they hate cold coffee, but is never actually taken seriously?
Is that really the binary, though? Leyla and Mark explicitly note that in just 2 minutes, using this method, you learn so much about the real person. It's not just I am a teacher. It becomes I am a fitness coach who helps people get strong, who grew up with bodyguard brothers, loves tacos, and hates cold coffee. It layers the professional with the personal. It humanizes the speaker in a way that dry corporate introductions completely fail to do.
Look, I don't disagree that humanizing the speaker is the ultimate goal. In fact, that's what we both want for these learners. Where we diverge is on the definition of what constitutes our humanity. I argue that our humanity is found in our motivations, why Leyla takes photos to capture moments, or why Mark wants to help people feel strong. It is not found in our arbitrary aversions, like Layla's refusal to eat scrambled eggs. The framework creates a highly memorable character, I will grant you that. But a memorable character is not the same thing as an understood person.
And I think that brings us to a really fascinating synthesis of our positions today. On one hand, I have argued that the mini-story and conversational ball concepts successfully gamify what is otherwise a massive, terrifying linguistic hurdle. By leaning into accessible contrasts like the beach boy from Miami versus the mountain girl in the cabin, the material turns an anxiety-inducing pop quiz into an engaging, highly accessible exchange. It uses a Trojan horse of triviality to sneak past the Blaine's emotional bouncers and get the conversation flowing.
And, my counter-perspective is that while this undeniably lowers the barrier to entry, over-relying on superficial preferences and universal irritations severely limits a learner's capacity to communicate substantive depth. It really risks building semantic muscle memory around a persona rather than building the vocabulary needed to express one's true identity.
Yet, despite our disagreement on the execution, I think we both clearly acknowledge the profound difficulty of the prompt itself. Tell me about yourself is a daunting existential question for absolutely anyone. I mean, native speakers freeze up on this all the time.
Oh, constantly.
Doing it while simultaneously managing the syntax, vocabulary, and cultural nuances of a second language is a monumental task. Overcoming that initial blank mind paralysis is a universally critical first step.
Absolutely. And the tension we are uncovering here isn't just about second language acquisition, right? It's about the fundamental human desire to be seen. There is an enduring tension in all human communication between being easily memorable, the quirky guy who passionately hates seafood, and being genuinely understood for our underlying values.
Which suggests there are so many more layers to explore regarding how identity is translated, filtered, and presented across languages. The source material from Leyla and Mark offers a really powerful lens into that exact negotiation.
It certainly does. It forces us to ask what parts of ourselves we are willing to simplify for the sake of fluency, and when we need to demand the vocabulary to be complex.
Exactly. Well, we'll leave it there for today without declaring a definitive winner between these two communicative philosophies. Instead, we invite you to reflect on our opening thought. Think about the next time you step out of the comforting binary world of grammatical rules and into the unpredictable, muddy waters of human connection. The next time someone looks across the table at you and says, "Tell me about yourself," which toolkit will you rely on? Will you play it safe and throw a light ball, or will you take the risk and throw a heavy one?